On the night of Halloween 1974, every parent's worst nightmare would unfold in a small Texas town. As the children of Deer Park, Texas were knocking on doors to collect candy, optician Ronald Clark O'Bryan was out with his two kids, 8-year-old Timmy and 5-year-old Elizabeth, as they were trick-or-treating in a suburban neighborhood near their home. Accompanying the O'Briens were their neighbors, Jim Bates and his young son. The group had approached a house with the lights off. No one appeared to be home. The kids pounded on the door anyways. The idea of free candy was just too sweet to ignore, but no one answered. Does anyone even live here? Why is no one answering? Growing more impatient, the kids went to a different house and Jim followed, leaving Ronald Clark O'Bryan behind. A short time later, Brian would catch up to the group and he would have good news. In hand, he obtained a few 21-inch pixie sticks, tubes of powdered sour candy. It turns out someone was home in that dark house after all. The sweets were handed out, one for each child. Before bed, Timmy was only allowed one treat from the evening's haul and picked his pixie sticks that his dad gave him. The powdered sugar was stuck in the straw, and when his dad helped dislodge the candy so he can take his first mouthful, it tasted bitter. He complained, so Ronald grabbed a glass of Kool-Aid to wash it down. Less than an hour later, Timothy O'Bryan was pronounced dead. Was the candy tainted? Was the dark house and Ronald O'Bryan in on all this? Why would you poison your own son? So many questions. I'm your host, Massxmordor, and this is Oddities, where I examine weird, strange, quirky, and morbid human history. Dr. Joseph A. Jaschemski, a chief medical examiner of nearby Harris County, would receive a call from Harris County prosecutor Mike Henton asking him what the young man's breath smelled like. A call to the morgue reviewed the scent of almonds coming from the boy's mouth. It's cyanide, said Dr. Jaschemski. An autopsy proved the medical examiner's hunch. A pathologist said Timothy had consumed enough cyanide to kill 2 people. Tests would later review that the top 2 inches of the pixie sticks had been packed with poison. The other children before they consumed them, and noted that someone used staples to seal the pixie sticks after tampering with them. That's what saved another boy's life that night, Hinton recalls. They found him in bed with the sweets in his hand, but he wasn't strong enough to undo the staples. The police took Ronald back to the neighborhood. The kids were trick-or-treating at that night, so he could direct them to the house where he picked up the candy. But he was stumped and couldn't find the house, and said he'd never seen the person responsible. That had just emerged from a doorway and handed him the candy. Investigators began to grow more suspicious. A few days went by, and it was incredibly frustrating, says Hinton. So they took O'Bryan out again and were pretty firm with him. The tactic worked. Ronald's memory came back and he was able to point to the house. The man who lived there wasn't home though, so officers went to his place of work, William Hobby P. Airport, and arrested him in front of his coworkers. Now the mystery is over. Case closed. But this man had an alibi, a claim or piece of evidence that one was elsewhere when an act, typically a criminal one, is alleged to have taken place. His wife and daughter were home and had turned out the lights early as they run out of candy. Colleagues and timesheets confirmed the man's story. This just increased Hinton's suspense further. He also heard O'Bryan was angry at his relatives for not staying up the night of Timmy's funeral, which he thought was odd. While Hinton was teaching a class at the Pasadena Police Academy, detectives arrived at Hinton's doorstep. They discovered that Ronald had recently taken out life insurance policies on both of his children, $10,000 per child in January of that year, and then a further $20,000 on each a month before Halloween. Investigators already knew Ronald owed debts of over $100,000, so when they found out he'd call his insurers to ask about the payment at 9 a.m. the morning after Timothy's death, it was clear the case against him was beginning to come together. Granted with a warrant, after a search of the O'Brien's house, a pair of scissors with plastic residue attached, which was similar to that found on the cyanide lace sweets, was found. O'Brien was arrested and taken in for questioning. As the investigation continued on, the evidence was becoming quite clear against Ronald. It turned out Ronald was going to community college, and in class, he would ask odd questions to the professor like, what is more lethal, cyanide or another type of poison? Another witness who worked at a chemical company in Houston told police a man was trying to come in and buy some cyanide but left after he was told the smallest amount you can buy. O'Brien entered a not guilty plea with his defense blaming the tainted candy on some untraceable boogeyman, a sick individual using the cover of Halloween to poison unsuspecting children. But friends, family, and co-workers all testified against the man the press refers to as the Candyman. On June 3rd, 1975, it took only 46 minutes for the jury to return a guilty verdict for one charge of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. An hour later, it was decided he would be executed by electric chair. Before and since the Deer Park poisoning, rumors of dodgy sweets being handed out have always surfaced around the time of Halloween. But whether the fear is that the candies actually did contain broken glass and razor blades, or that if they're actually ecstasy pills, that's not much evidence to suggest parents actually have anything to worry about. In 2000, a Minneapolis man was charged with putting needles in Snickers bars he'd handed out to trick-or-treaters, but the only victim he claimed was a teenager who got a slight prick from the hidden sharp object. Since Timothy O'Brien's death, there hasn't been a single case where a child has accidentally died after consuming contaminated Halloween treats. O'Brien's appeal avenues were explored and all turned down for nearly a decade. After his guilty verdict, it wasn't until March 31st, 1984, when all routes to survival had been exhausted, that he was finally put to death for his crimes. By this point, the US Supreme Court had ruled the electric chair a cruel and unusual punishment, so his life was ended with a lethal injection. Outside the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, a crowd of about 300 people gathered to hear if the man, the Halloween poisoner, had met his end, shouting trick or treat and throwing candy at anti-death penalty protesters. At 12:48 a.m., Ronald was pronounced dead. Lights out, Candyman. Now you won't be able to ruin Halloween for any more children. Okay guys, this concludes this episode of Oddities about the man who killed Halloween. How far would you go to pay your debts? Ronald Clark O'Bryan sure showed us how far he would go to pay off his debt. How can you poison your own child? O'Bryan did a pretty terrible job of hiding his crime, and now he's paying for it 6 feet under. One more thing to remember, don't eat pixie stick.